My father-in-law said, "I'm going to help you." And he did. He helped himself to my body for years. And when my husband found out, well, that's when everything I thought I knew about family crumbled like old newspaper in the rain. I'm Ruth Ellen Patterson, 78 years old now, sitting here on my front porch in Cedar Falls, Tennessee, watching the same sunset that's painted this sky for decades, but seeing it through eyes that finally learned the difference between keeping peace and keeping secrets. The wind chimes I hung last spring still sing the same song they did when I first found my voice, when I first said the word no loud enough for the whole world to hear. There's a door lock on my bedroom door now, when I installed myself with these weathered hands, and every night when I turn that key, I remember that some victories come quietly in the small acts of taking back what was stolen. The scent of lavender drifts from the garden I replanted after I reclaimed my life, each purple stem a testament to the strength I never knew I had. Before I tell you this story, the hardest story I've ever had to share, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes the most important stories are the hardest ones to tell, and sometimes one woman's truth can light the path for another's healing. It was 1954 when I married James Patterson, a good man with calloused hands and dreams bigger than his paycheck, in the little white church on Maple Street where 3 generations of Pattersons had said their vows before us. I was 19, fresh out of high school with nothing but a hope chest full of embroidered pillowcases and a heart full of faith that love could conquer anything the world threw at us. James worked at the lumber mill alongside his father, Thomas Patterson, a man who commanded respect in our small town, who sat in the front pew every Sunday, who everyone called Big Tom because of his broad shoulders and booming laugh that could fill a room. Those were different times when women didn't question their elders, when family hierarchy was sacred law, when a father-in-law's word carried the weight of scripture in a young bride's life. We moved into the little house behind Big Tom's property, close enough that he could walk over for morning coffee, close enough that he became a daily fixture in our lives, close enough that privacy became a luxury I didn't even know I was losing. Big Tom had buried his wife, James's mother, 2 years before our wedding, and everyone said how wonderful it was that he'd have a daughter-in-law to help fill that empty house with life again. The neighbors praised me for being such a devoted daughter-in-law, always ready with a hot meal or a listening ear, always respectful, always accommodating. James worked long hours at the mill, sometimes double shifts when orders were heavy, leaving me home during those long Tennessee afternoons when the heat made everything shimmer like a mirage, and Big Tom would appear at my back door, asking if I needed help with the heavy lifting, the high shelves, the broken things that seemed to multiply whenever James wasn't around. In those days, refusing help from your elder was considered disrespectful, ungrateful even, and I had been raised to be grateful, raised to be helpful, raised to never make waves in the calm waters of family peace. The town saw what they wanted to see, a helpful father-in-law looking after his son's young wife, a family taking care of each other the way families were supposed to do. I learned to set an extra place at the dinner table, learned to always have sweet tea ready, learned to smile when Big Tom's compliments about my cooking started including comments about my figure, my dress, the way I moved around the kitchen like I was dancing just for him. Our little house had thin walls and creaky floorboards that announced every footstep, every movement, every late-night visit that Big Tom claimed was just checking to make sure we were safe. James would come home exhausted, sawdust in his hair and ache in his bones, grateful that his father was there to help his young wife, proud that his family was close-knit and caring. Sunday dinners at Big Tom's house became tradition, with me cooking for both households, serving the men first as was proper, cleaning up while they talked business and weather and the state of the world. Big Tom would insist I sit beside him at his big oak table, would pat the seat of the chair next to his, would fill my plate with portions I couldn't finish while commenting on how a young woman needed to keep her strength up. The church ladies would smile and nod when they saw us together at the grocery store, Big Tom carrying my heavy bags, opening doors, treating me like delicate china that might break if not handled carefully. What they saw was old-fashioned courtesy. What I was beginning to feel was something else entirely, something that made my skin crawl even as I smiled and thanked him for his kindness. Those early years of marriage were supposed to be the honeymoon period, when everything was new and sweet and full of promise, but I found myself counting the hours until James would come home, Found myself making excuses to visit my own mother more often. Found myself developing headaches that seemed to coincide with Big Tom's afternoon visits. When I tried to mention my discomfort to James, he'd brush it off with a laugh, telling me how lucky I was to have such a caring father-in-law, how many wives would give anything to have such help around the house. The seeds of silence were planted early, watered with good intentions, and fertilized with the belief that keeping family peace was more important than speaking uncomfortable truths. For the first 2 years of our marriage, I believed I was living the life every small town girl dreamed of having. James would wake before dawn, kiss my forehead while I pretended to still be sleeping, and head off to the mill with his lunch pail packed and a thermos full of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I'd spend my mornings tending to our little vegetable garden, hanging laundry on the line that stretched between two old oak trees, humming hymns from Sunday service while I worked. The afternoons belonged to housework and cooking, preparing meals that filled our tiny kitchen with the sense of cornbread and pot roast, creating a home that felt like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. James would come home dusty and tired, but always with a smile for me, always ready to sit on our front porch swing and tell me about his day while I mended his work shirts or shelled peas for dinner. We'd talk about our dreams during those golden hours before sunset, planning the children we'd have, the bigger house we'd build someday, the life we were going to create together with nothing but love and determination. Saturday nights were for dancing to the radio in our living room, James spinning me around our braided rug, while Hank Williams sang about love and heartache, my bare feet sliding on the polished wood floors as we laughed like teenagers. Sundays meant church in the morning and lazy afternoons reading the paper together. James's head in my lap while I worked on my embroidery, the windows open to catch whatever breeze Tennessee decided to offer. I was learning to be a wife, learning to manage a household budget, learning to make James's favorite biscuits the way his mother used to, learning to find joy in the simple rhythms of married life. We had our own little traditions, like Friday night fish fry at the church social hall, where I'd wear my best dress and James would brag to anyone who'd listen about what a fine cook his wife was becoming. Our neighbors, the Hendersons, would stop by for coffee on Tuesday evenings, and Mrs. Henderson would teach me to crochet while the men discussed baseball and politics on the porch. I felt proud walking through town on James's arm, proud when the older women at church complimented my pork pie or my needlework, proud to be Mrs. James Patterson, respected wife in a respectable family. Even Big Tom seemed like nothing more than a lonely widower who enjoyed having young people around, who liked to tell stories about James as a boy, who brought us fresh vegetables from his larger garden and helped James fix whatever broke around our little house. Those early days had a sweetness to them, like honey poured over warm cornbread, slow and golden and satisfying in a way that made me believe I understood what happiness was supposed to feel like. I'd wake up each morning grateful for the life I was building, grateful for a husband who loved me, grateful for a place in a community that valued family and faith above all else. The future stretched ahead of us like a clear country road, straight and predictable and full of promise, and I walked that road with confidence, believing that goodness and hard work would be enough to carry us through whatever challenges life might bring our way. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in September 1956. When the leaves were just starting to turn, and the air carried that crisp promise of autumn that made everything feel clean and hopeful. James was working a double shift because the mill had gotten a big order from Nashville, and I was in the kitchen making apple butter from the fruit Big Tom had brought me from his orchard, the whole house sweet with cinnamon and brown sugar. I was standing at the stove, stirring the thick mixture that bubbled like lava in my biggest pot, when I heard Big Tom's boots on the back porch, that familiar heavy step that had become as regular as clockwork over the past 2 years. He knocked once and walked right in, as was his habit, carrying a bushel basket of late tomatoes and wearing that smile that always made me feel like I should be grateful for his attention. "Thought you might kin these before the first frost," he said, setting the basket on my kitchen table with more force than necessary, tomatoes rolling across the worn-wood surface like red marbles. I thanked him the way I'd been raised to thank my elders, wiping my hands on my apron and turning to examine his gift. But when I bent over the basket to sort the good tomatoes from the bruised ones, I felt his presence behind me, closer than he'd ever stood before, close enough that I could smell the tobacco on his breath and feel the heat radiating from his body. "You're looking mighty fine today, Ruth Ellen," he said, his voice different somehow, lower and rougher than the jovial tone he usually used when James was around. I straightened up quickly, clutching a tomato in each hand like they were weapons, my heart starting to pound in a way that had nothing to do with the work I'd been doing. That's when his hand touched my waist, just a light touch at first, almost like an accident, but when I stepped sideways toward the sink, his hand followed, pressing more firmly against the small of my back. "Big Tom," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. I should get back to my apple butter, but he didn't move away, didn't take the hint that any decent man would have taken. Instead, he stepped even closer, trapping me between his body and the kitchen counter, his other hand coming up to touch my hair in a way that made my skin crawl with a fear I'd never felt before. "James is a lucky man," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "But a man works hard. Sometimes he can't appreciate what he's got at home." I tried to duck away from him, but his hands were stronger than I expected, holding me in place while he pressed himself against me in a way that left no doubt about his intentions. The tomatoes fell from my hands, splattering red juice across my clean kitchen floor like blood, and I heard myself make a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a scream, a sound I'd never made before, but would make too many times in the years that followed. Now," he said, like he was soothing a frightened animal. "No need to get all worked up. I'm just showing you some appreciation that my boy's too tired to give." His hands moved in ways that made me want to disappear completely, made me want to crawl out of my own skin and run screaming into the September afternoon. But I was frozen, paralyzed by shock and fear and the terrible understanding that everything I'd believed about safety and family and the sanctuary of my own home had just crumbled around me like a house built on sand. When he finally stepped back, adjusting his belt and smoothing his hair like nothing had happened, I was shaking so hard I had to grip the counter to stay standing. "This'll be our little secret," he said, his voice back to that familiar jovial tone. "Wouldn't want to worry James with things he don't need to know about." Then he walked out my back door like he owned it, like he owned me, leaving me standing in my kitchen with tomato juice on my shoes and the terrible knowledge that my life had just changed forever in ways I didn't even have words for yet. I stood in that kitchen for what felt like hours after he left, but it was probably only minutes. The apple butter kept bubbling on the stove, making those thick, wet, popping sounds, like it was mocking me. I turned off the heat with shaking hands and just stared at those tomatoes scattered across my clean floor. The red juice had spread into the cracks between the floorboards, staining the wood I'd scrubbed on my hands and knees just that morning. I wanted to clean it up, but my body wouldn't move right. My hands kept shaking. My legs felt like they were made of water. I kept touching my waist where his hand had been, like I could somehow wipe away the feeling of him touching me. But it wouldn't go away. That sick, heavy feeling, like something dark had crawled under my skin and was living there now. When James came home that night, I had cleaned up the tomatoes. I had finished the apple butter. I had set the table like nothing happened. But when he kissed me hello, I flinched. I actually stepped backward, away from my own husband. James noticed. Of course he noticed. "You feeling all right, Ruth Ellen?" he asked, his eyes full of concern. The kind of concern that's used to make me feel safe. But now it just made me feel guilty, like I was already lying to him, even though I hadn't said a word. "Just tired," I told him, which wasn't really a lie. I was tired. Tired in a way I'd never been before. Tired down to my bones, like something inside me had been broken and was bleeding energy out of me drop by drop. We sat at dinner, James talking about his day at the mill, about the big order they were finishing, about how proud his father was of the work they were doing together. Every time he mentioned Big Tom, my stomach twisted, like someone was wringing it out like a dish rag. "Daddy brought you some tomatoes today," James said, smiling. "Said you were going to can them. He sure does think the world of you, Ruth Ellen. Says you're the daughter he never had." I made some sound, something that might have passed for agreement, but inside I was screaming. Inside I was running down that country road, running until my lungs burned, until I was far away from this house, this family, this terrible secret that was already growing inside me like a cancer. That night, when James reached for me in bed, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't. I made excuses. said I had a headache, said I was coming down with something. And James, sweet James, he rubbed my back and told me to rest, told me he hoped I'd feel better in the morning. But I knew I wouldn't feel better in the morning. I knew something fundamental had shifted, like a fault line running through the foundation of my life. And any day now, the whole thing might just split wide open. I lay awake all night, listening to James breathe beside me, trying to figure out how to tell him what had happened. But every time I formed the words in my mind, they sounded crazy. They sounded like something a hysterical woman would make up. Big Tom was respected in this town. He was James's father. He was a pillar of the church. Who was going to believe that he had pressed himself against his son's wife in her own kitchen? Who was going to believe that a man everyone trusted had touched me in ways that made my skin crawl? And what if they did believe me? What would that do to James? What would that do to this family I was trying so hard to fit into? What would that do to the life we were building together? So I said nothing. I swallowed those words, pushed them down deep, told myself it was just one time, just one moment of weakness on his part, that it would never happen again, that if I just pretended it didn't happen, maybe it would go away. Maybe we could go back to the way things were before. But deep down, in the part of me that knew truth from lies, I already understood that there was no going back. That Big Tom had shown me exactly who he was, and that this was just the beginning of something much worse. The visits started coming more often after that. Every few days, Big Tom would find some excuse to come by when James was at work. He'd bring me vegetables from his garden, or offer to fix something that wasn't really broken, or just show up, saying he was checking on me, making sure I was safe while James was away. And every time he came, I could feel my heart start racing before he even knocked on the door, because I knew what he really wanted. The second time, he cornered me in the pantry while I was getting flour for biscuits, pressed himself against me while I tried to reach the top shelf, his hands roaming places they had no business being, while he whispered things in my ear that made me want to scrub my brain clean. "You like this," he said, even though I was clearly trying to get away from him. "You married into this family, and I'm family too." Like that gave him some kind of right to my body, some kind of ownership over me that came with the Patterson name. I started making excuses to leave the house when I knew James would be working late. I'd go visit my mother, or volunteer extra time at the church. Anything to avoid being alone when Big Tom might decide to pay me one of his helpful visits. But he was smart about it. He'd watch, he'd wait, he'd figure out my patterns, and then he'd show up at exactly the wrong moment. When I was trapped, when I couldn't run away without causing a scene. The worst part was how normal he acted afterward. How he'd sit at our dinner table and tell James stories about work. How he'd compliment my cooking and pat my hand in front of my husband like he was just being affectionate. Like his fingers hadn't been touching me in ways that made my skin crawl just hours before. James never noticed anything wrong. He was working so hard those days, coming home exhausted, grateful that his father was there to help look after me. "You're so lucky," he'd say. "Most women don't have such a caring father-in-law." And I'd smile and nod, because what else could I do? How could I tell my husband that his caring father was anything but caring? How could I destroy the relationship between father and son? How could I tear apart a family that had welcomed me in? I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake listening to every sound outside our house, wondering if that creak was just the wind, or if it was Big Tom coming to check on me again. One night I got up and pushed our kitchen table in front of the back door. James found it there in the morning. "What's this for?" he asked, looking confused. I told him I'd been worried about burglars, about all the break-ins happening over in the next county. He laughed, kissed my forehead, moved the table back where it belonged. "Nobody's going to bother the Patterson women," he said. "Daddy would never let anything happen to you. If only he knew. If only he could see what his daddy was already letting happen to me." But Big Tom was careful. He never left marks, never did anything that would show. He was smart enough to know that his word would always carry more weight than mine. Smart enough to know that in 1956, in small-town Tennessee, a young wife's word against a respected elder's word wasn't really a contest at all. The abuse got worse gradually. like a slow poison working its way through my system. Each incident a little more invasive than the last. Each violation taking away a little more of who I used to be. Until I started feeling like a stranger in my own skin. Like the Ruth Ellen who had walked down that church aisle in her white dress had been replaced by someone else. Someone scared. Someone dirty. Someone who jumped at shadows and couldn't look her own husband in the eye. I tried dropping hints to James, saying that maybe his father visited too often, that maybe we needed more privacy as newlyweds. But James just saw it as me being shy, being modest. He'd chuckle and say that family was important, that we should be grateful to have Big Tom looking out for us. So I learned to live with it, learned to predict when Big Tom would come by, learned to position myself where he couldn't corner me easily, learned to keep conversations short and always stay near the doors. But I was fighting a losing battle, because this was his town, his family, his territory, and I was just the girl who had married into it. The girl who was supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness the Patterson men decided to throw her way, even when that kindness came with a price I never agreed to pay. For 3 years, the nightmare continued, and got worse, much worse. By 1959, Big Tom wasn't just touching me anymore. He was taking what he wanted, whenever he wanted it, always when James was at work, always with that same sick smile, that same whispered threats about keeping our little secret. The spare key James had given him, the key that was supposed to be for emergencies, became Big Tom's invitation to walk into my house whenever the mood struck him. I'd be doing laundry, or preparing dinner, or just sitting in my living room reading, and suddenly he'd be there, standing in my doorway like he owned the place, like he owned me. "Time for your father-in-law to get some appreciation," he'd say, and my whole body would go cold, because I knew what was coming next, and I knew there was nothing I could do to stop it. I tried changing the locks once, told James I'd lost my key, but Big Tom just told him he needed a spare, for safety reasons, and James made me a new one that same day, handed it right over to his father, never suspecting that he was giving him unlimited access to violate his own wife. The worst part wasn't even the physical abuse, though that was horrible enough. It was how it poisoned everything else in my life. I couldn't enjoy James's touch anymore, because all touch had become contaminated in my mind. I couldn't sit through Sunday sermons about forgiveness and family values, because the man everyone was praising, the man they held up as an example of Christian living, was the same man who was destroying me piece by piece every week. I started having what I now know were panic attacks. But back then, I just thought I was going crazy. My heart would start racing for no reason. I'd break out in cold sweats during perfectly normal conversations. I'd have to excuse myself from church dinners, from social gatherings, because being around people, especially men, made me feel like I couldn't breathe. James noticed I was changing. How could he not notice? I'd lost weight. My clothes hung loose on my frame. I had dark circles under my eyes from all the sleepless nights. I jumped at sudden noises. I couldn't concentrate on simple tasks. I'd burn dinner because my mind was somewhere else, somewhere trying to figure out how to escape this trap I was caught in. "Maybe you should see Doc Matthews," James suggested one evening, after I'd spent the whole dinner staring at my plate, unable to eat. "You haven't been yourself lately." But what was I supposed to tell Doc Matthews? That my father-in-law was raping me regularly, that the pillar of the community, the man who sat in the front pew every Sunday, was using me like I was his personal property. In 1959, in small-town Tennessee, a woman making accusations like that against a respected man, she'd be the one they'd think was crazy. She'd be the one they'd blame for tempting him, for not being grateful enough for his help, for trying to destroy a good family with her wild stories. So I told Doc Matthews I'd been having trouble sleeping. He prescribed me pills, little white pills that were supposed to calm my nerves, but they just made everything fuzzy around the edges, made me feel like I was living underwater, which in a way, I suppose I was. The abuse became routine, scheduled like any other household chore. Big Tom would come by Tuesday afternoons, Thursday mornings, Saturday evenings when James was at the hardware store. He had my schedule memorized, knew exactly when I'd be most vulnerable, most isolated, and each time, He'd take a little more, push the boundaries a little further, until there was nothing left of me that he hadn't claimed as his own. I started leaving my body during the worst of it, just mentally checking out, floating somewhere near the ceiling, watching it happen to someone else, some other woman who looked like me, but wasn't really me, because the real me, the Ruth Ellen who had married James with such hope and joy, she was dying a little more each time Big Tom walked through my door. The whole town still saw us as the perfect family, the successful father and son business partnership, the devoted daughter-in-law who always had a kind word and a home-cooked meal ready. They saw Big Tom helping me carry groceries to my car, opening doors for me, treating me with what they thought was old-fashioned respect. If they noticed that I didn't smile as much anymore, that I seemed nervous around men, that I always found excuses to avoid being alone with anyone, they probably just thought I was shy, modest, the way a good Christian wife should be. Meanwhile, James was working harder than ever, trying to build us a future, saving money for the bigger house we'd planned, talking about the children we'd have someday, never knowing that his own father was stealing that future from us, one violation at a time, never knowing that every time he praised his daddy for looking after me, every time he talked about how lucky we were to have such a caring family, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest, because I wanted to tell him. God knows I wanted to tell him, but I also knew it would destroy him, destroy his relationship with his father, destroy his faith in family, destroy the business they built together, destroy everything James believed about the people he loved most. So I kept my mouth shut and let it destroy me instead. Everything changed on a Thursday morning in March 1960. I was 6 years into this nightmare. 6 years of living in fear, of jumping at shadows, of dying a little more inside every time Big Tom walked through my door. James had left for work early that morning. There was some problem at the mill, some machinery that needed fixing before the day shift started. I was in the kitchen making bread, kneading the dough, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of it. The push and fold, something mindless that might give my brain a rest from the constant fear. That's when I heard the back door open, that familiar heavy step, those boots I'd learned to hate. But something was different this time. James's voice, calling out to me, "Ruth Ellen, I forgot my toolbox. Have you seen my—" And then silence, complete silence. I looked up from my bread dough, and there was James, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, staring at something behind me, his face white as chalk, his mouth open like he was trying to speak, but no words would come. I turned around, and there was Big Tom, standing way too close to me, his hand on my shoulder, his other hand reaching for the tie on my robe, in broad daylight, in my own kitchen, with his son standing right there watching. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The three of us frozen like some horrible tableau, like a photograph of the exact moment when everything falls apart. Then James made a sound, not quite a word, more like something being torn out of him. "What?" he whispered. "What is this?" It wasn't really a question, because he could see what it was. He could see his father's hands on his wife. He could see the way I was trying to pull away, the way Big Tom wasn't letting me. He could see 6 years of truth written across my face in that one instant. Big Tom stepped back, smooth as anything, like nothing had happened. "Just helping Ruth Ellen with her robe," he said. That same jovial voice he'd been using to lie to his son for years. Thing was coming untied. But James wasn't buying it. Not anymore. Maybe because he'd seen the look of pure terror on my face. Maybe because he'd seen how his father's hands lingered on my body. Maybe because some part of him had always known, deep down, that something wasn't right. That his wife's gradual disappearance, her fear, her jumping at shadows, her inability to let him touch her anymore. Maybe some part of him had always suspected what he just couldn't let himself believe. "Get out," James said, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. But there was something in those 2 words, something hard and cold and final, something I'd never heard from my gentle husband before. Big Tom laughed, that same booming laugh that had charmed the whole town for decades. "Now, son, don't get all worked up over nothing. You know how women can be. how they misinterpret things. But James took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists, his whole body shaking with rage. I said, "Get out." Louder this time. Much louder. "Get out of my house. Get away from my wife. Don't you ever, touch her again." Big Tom's expression changed then, the mask slipping. For just a moment, I saw something ugly underneath, something cruel and calculating, something that had been there all along, hidden behind the grandfather's smile and the church deacon's handshake. "You're making a mistake," he said to James, not looking at me at all, like I wasn't even there, like I'd never been there. "You're going to regret this. Both of you are going to regret this." Then he walked out, through the same back door he'd used to terrorize me for 6 years, his boots heavy on the porch steps, getting fainter and fainter until finally, they were gone. James and I stood there for a long time after he left, not moving, not speaking, just breathing, like we were both trying to convince ourselves that it was really over, that the nightmare might actually be ending. Then James looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something breaking behind his eyes, something that had been holding him together, holding us together. "How long?" he said, not really asking, because I think he already knew. I think he'd known for longer than either of us wanted to admit. 6 years, I whispered. The first words I'd spoken since James had come home. The first time I'd said the truth out loud, ever, and saying it felt like breathing after being underwater for so long. 6 years. Since 1954. It started 2 years after we got married. James made that sound again. That tearing sound, like something inside him was being ripped apart. Then he was across the room, his arms around me, holding me tight, but not too tight, like he was afraid I might break, like I was something precious that had been damaged and needed to be handled with infinite care. "I'm sorry," he said into my hair. "God, Ruth Ellen, I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have protected you. I should have seen what he was doing." And for the first time in 6 years, I let myself cry, really cry. Not the silent tears I'd shed in secret, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside me I didn't even know it existed. James held me while I fell apart in his arms, held me while 6 years of terror and shame and violation poured out of me like poison from a wound. And I knew, even though everything was broken, even though we had a long road ahead of us, even though Big Tom's threats were probably just beginning, I knew that for the first time since 1956, I wasn't alone anymore. Big Tom didn't take his banishment quietly. Within a week of James throwing him out of our house, the whole town knew something had happened between the Patterson men, but they didn't know what. And Big Tom, he was smart enough, manipulative enough, to control the narrative before we could. He started telling people that James had been influenced by his hysterical wife, that I'd been acting strange for years, having nervous breakdowns, making wild accusations against innocent people. "Poor girl's been under a lot of stress," he'd tell anyone who would listen. "Sometimes women, especially young wives who can't seem to get pregnant, well, sometimes they start imagining things that aren't there." The pregnancy comment, that was the cruelest cut of all, because it was true that James and I hadn't been blessed with children yet. And in 1960, in our small town, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to give her husband sons. The fact that I'd been too traumatized, too violated, too broken inside to even let James touch me most nights, that wasn't something I could explain without telling the whole truth. So Big Tom's version of events, his story about the unstable wife who couldn't fulfill her duties, who was lashing out at the men trying to help her, that version made sense to people. That version fit their understanding of how the world worked. The first person to turn away from me was Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor, the woman who had taught me to crochet on those Tuesday evenings that felt like a lifetime ago. I saw her at the grocery store, smiled and waved like I always did, but she looked right through me, like I wasn't even there. Then she walked to the other side of the store, avoiding me completely. That night, I asked James if he knew what was happening, why people were treating me differently. "Daddy's been talking," he said, his jaw tight with anger, "spreading lies about you, about us, trying to make himself look like the victim in all this. The economic pressure started almost immediately. Big Tom still owned half the lumber mill, the bigger half, and he made it clear to his business partners, his customers, his drinking buddies at the American Legion, that anyone who continued to do business with James Patterson, well, they might find themselves having trouble with Big Tom. Orders started getting canceled. Deliveries got mysteriously delayed. Customers who had been loyal to the Patterson mill for generations, suddenly they were taking their business elsewhere. James tried to keep working, tried to maintain what was left of their partnership. But how do you work alongside a man who has been raping your wife for 6 years? How do you pretend that everything is normal when every time you look at him, you see his hands on the woman you love? You see years of violation, years of lies, years of your own blindness. The breaking point came when James confronted Big Tom at the mill, in front of the other workers, told him exactly what kind of man he really was, what he'd been doing to me, how he betrayed his own family. Big Tom didn't deny it. Not completely. He just shrugged, like it didn't matter. Like I didn't matter. She never said no, he told his son. Right there in front of everyone. A woman who doesn't say no. Well, that's not rape. That's just a woman who knows her place. James hit him then, knocked his own father flat on the sawdust floor, broke his nose, split his lip, drew blood from the man who had given him life, and then raised him to believe that women were property. That family meant loyalty above everything else, including truth, including justice, including protection for the innocent. By the next morning, the whole town knew about the fight, but they didn't know the real reason behind it. All they saw was a son who had attacked his own father, a young man who had chosen his hysterical wife over his family patriarch, an ungrateful boy who had bitten the hand that fed him. The church was the worst part. We'd been attending services at Cedar Falls Baptist since we got married, had our wedding there, had planned to baptize our future children there. But after the fight, after the rumors started spreading, Reverend Matthews pulled James aside one Sunday morning, suggested that maybe we should find another congregation. Until things settle down, he said. Until your family situation gets resolved. That was church speak for until you apologize to your father and put your wife back in her place. Until you stop making waves. Stop embarrassing the community with your family drama. Stop forcing good Christian people to take sides in matters they didn't want to understand. James and I started talking about leaving town, starting over somewhere else, somewhere Big Tom's influence couldn't reach. But we had no money saved, no job prospects, no family willing to take us in after we'd become the scandal of Cedar Falls. I was still having panic attacks, still jumping at shadows, still unable to sleep through the night without waking up in cold sweats. And now James was carrying his own trauma, his own shame, the knowledge that he'd failed to protect his wife, that he'd been living and working alongside a monster for years without seeing the truth. We were both broken, both lost, both trying to figure out how to rebuild our lives from the wreckage that Big Tom had left behind. And the worst part was knowing that he was still out there, still telling his lies, still playing the victim, still convinced that what he'd done to me was his right, his privilege, something he was owed simply because he was a Patterson man, and I was just a Patterson wife. The final confrontation came 6 months later, at my own mother's funeral. Mama had been sick for weeks with pneumonia, and when she finally passed in October 1960, I thought at least I'd have one day, one single day, to grieve in peace, to say goodbye to the woman who had raised me, who had taught me to be strong, even though I'd forgotten how to use that strength. The whole town came to the service, because that's what small towns do. They show up for death, even when they won't show up for life, even when they turn their backs on you while you're still breathing. I was sitting in the front pew at Cedar Falls Baptist, the same church that had asked us to leave, but they couldn't deny a grieving daughter the right to bury her mother. James beside me, his hand holding mine, both of us dressed in black, both of us trying to hold ourselves together for just a few more hours. That's when Big Tom walked in, bold as brass, wearing his best suit, acting like nothing had happened, like he belonged there, like he had every right to intrude on my grief, to contaminate even this, even my goodbye to my mother. He sat 3 rows behind us, close enough that I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders, close enough that I could hear him whispering to the people around him, probably telling them more lies about his crazy daughter-in-law, more stories about how he'd tried to help, how he'd been misunderstood, how family loyalty meant nothing to young people these days. I tried to focus on Reverend Matthews's words, about Mama's life, about her faith, about the peace she'd found, but all I could hear was Big Tom behind me, breathing, existing, taking up space in the same room where I was trying to honor my mother's memory. When it came time for people to share memories, Big Tom stood up. My blood turned to ice water, because I knew he was about to do something awful, something that would hurt me even more than he already had. I'd like to say something about Martha, he said, using my mother's first name like they'd been friends, like he'd known her well. She raised a fine daughter, a daughter who married into our family, and even though we've had our difficulties lately, I want Ruth Ellen to know that she'll always be a Patterson to me, always be under my protection. The way he said protection, like it was something precious he was offering, instead of the threat it really was, the promise of more violation, more control, more years of treating me like his personal property. Something inside me snapped then, something that had been bending and bending for 6 years, finally broke. I stood up, right there in the middle of the service, in front of the entire congregation, in front of everyone who had turned their backs on me, everyone who had believed his lies, everyone who had chosen his version of the truth over mine. No, I said, my voice carrying clear across that silent church. No, I will never, ever, be under your protection again. The whole congregation turned to stare at me, but I didn't care anymore. I was done caring what they thought, done caring about their approval, their acceptance, their judgment. This man, I said, pointing at Big Tom, my finger steady as a rock. This man you all respect. This pillar of your community. This deacon of your church. He raped me. For 6 years, he used the key my husband gave him to come into my house, into my kitchen, into my bedroom, and he took what he wanted, whenever he wanted it, while you all praised him for being such a caring father-in-law. The silence in that church was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. You could have heard dust settling on the wooden pews. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. They just stared at me like I'd grown a second head, like I was speaking a foreign language. He told me it was our little secret, I continued, my voice getting stronger with every word. He told me that nobody would believe me if I told. He told me that I should be grateful. Grateful for his attention. Grateful that he was teaching me my place in the Patterson family. Well, I want you all to know, this is not gratitude. This is the truth. And I'm done being ashamed of something he did to me. Something he chose to do. Something he kept choosing to do. For 6 years, Big Tom tried to speak then. Tried to use that smooth voice. That practiced charm. Now, Ruth Ellen, you're upset about your mother. You're not thinking clearly. But I cut him off. For the first time in 6 years, I cut him off. I am thinking more clearly than I ever have in my life, I said. And I want everyone in this room to know exactly who you are. Not the man you pretend to be on Sundays. Not the respected businessman. Not the loving grandfather. But the rapist. The predator. The man who destroyed his own son's marriage. Who violated his own family. Who used his position in this community to hurt the people who were supposed to trust him most. Then I looked around that church, at all those faces, some shocked, some horrified, some still skeptical, still not ready to believe that their pillar of righteousness could be capable of such evil. And I want all of you to know, I said, that if he's done this to me, he's probably done it to others, other women who were too afraid to speak up, too ashamed to tell the truth, too worried about what people like you would think of them. So if you're sitting here today, if you've been hurt by this man, know that you're not alone anymore. Know that his power over us ends today, right here, right now. I sat back down then, my whole body shaking, but not from fear this time, from relief, from the incredible, overwhelming relief of finally telling the truth, of finally using my voice, of finally fighting back against the man who had stolen so much from me, but who would never steal my silence again. The final confrontation came 6 months later, At my own mother's funeral. Mama had been sick for weeks with pneumonia, and when she finally passed in October 1960, I thought at least I'd have one day, one single day, to grieve in peace, to say goodbye to the woman who had raised me, who had taught me to be strong, even though I'd forgotten how to use that strength. The whole town came to the service, because that's what small towns do. They show up for death, even when they won't show up for life, even when they turn their backs on you while you're still breathing. I was sitting in the front pew at Cedar Falls Baptist, the same church that had asked us to leave, but they couldn't deny a grieving daughter the right to bury her mother. James beside me, his hand holding mine, both of us dressed in black, both of us trying to hold ourselves together for just a few more hours. That's when Big Tom walked in, bold as brass, wearing his best suit, acting like nothing had happened, like he belonged there, like he had every right to intrude on my grief, to contaminate even this, even my goodbye to my mother. He sat 3 rows behind us, close enough that I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders, close enough that I could hear him whispering to the people around him, probably telling them more lies about his crazy daughter-in-law, more stories about how he'd tried to help, how he'd been misunderstood, how family loyalty meant nothing to young people these days. I tried to focus on Reverend Matthews's words, about Mama's life, about her faith, about the peace she'd found, but all I could hear was Big Tom behind me, breathing, existing, taking up space in the same room where I was trying to honor my mother's memory. When it came time for people to share memories, Big Tom stood up. My blood turned to ice water, because I knew he was about to do something awful, something that would hurt me even more than he already had. I'd like to say something about Martha, he said, using my mother's first name like they'd been friends, like he'd known her well. She raised a fine daughter, a daughter who married into our family, and even though we've had our difficulties lately, I want Ruth Ellen to know that she'll always be a Patterson to me, always be under my protection. The way he said protection, like it was something precious he was offering, instead of the threat it really was, the promise of more violation, more control, more years of treating me like his personal property. Something inside me snapped then, something that had been bending and bending for 6 years, finally broke. I stood up, right there in the middle of the service, in front of the entire congregation, in front of everyone who had turned their backs on me, everyone who had believed his lies, everyone who had chosen his version of the truth over mine. No, I said, my voice carrying clear across that silent church. No, I will never, ever, be under your protection again. The whole congregation turned to stare at me, but I didn't care anymore. I was done caring what they thought, done caring about their approval, their acceptance, their judgment. This man, I said, pointing at Big Tom, my finger steady as a rock, this man you all respect, this pillar of your community, this deacon of your church, he raped me. For 6 years, he used the key my husband gave him to come into my house, into my kitchen, into my bedroom, and he took what he wanted, whenever he wanted it, while you all praised him for being such a caring father-in-law. The silence in that church was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. You could have heard dust settling on the wooden pews. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. They just stared at me like I'd grown a second head, like I was speaking a foreign language. He told me it was our little secret, I continued, my voice getting stronger with every word. He told me that nobody would believe me if I told. He told me that I should be grateful. Grateful for his attention. Grateful that he was teaching me my place in the Patterson family. Well, I want you all to know, this is not gratitude. This is the truth. And I'm done being ashamed of something he did to me. Something he chose to do. Something he kept choosing to do. For 6 years, Big Tom tried to speak then. Tried to use that smooth voice. That practiced charm. Now, Ruth Ellen, you're upset about your mother. You're not thinking clearly. But I cut him off. For the first time in 6 years, I cut him off. I am thinking more clearly than I ever have in my life, I said. And I want everyone in this room to know exactly who you are. Not the man you pretend to be on Sundays. Not the respected businessman. Not the loving grandfather. But the rapist. The predator. The man who destroyed his own son's marriage, who violated his own family, who used his position in this community to hurt the people who were supposed to trust him most. Then I looked around that church, at all those faces, some shocked, some horrified, some still skeptical, still not ready to believe that their pillar of righteousness could be capable of such evil. And I want all of you to know, I said, that if he's done this to me, he's probably done it to others, other women who were too afraid to speak up, too ashamed to tell the truth, too worried about what people like you would think of them. So if you're sitting here today, if you've been hurt by this man, know that you're not alone anymore. Know that his power over us ends today, right here, right now. I sat back down then, my whole body shaking, but not from fear this time, from relief, from the incredible, overwhelming relief of finally telling the truth, of finally using my voice, of finally fighting back against the man who had stolen so much from me, but who would never steal my silence again. The silence in that church stretched on for what felt like eternity. Then all at once, everything exploded. People started talking, whispering, some standing up, some sitting down, some heading for the doors like the building was on fire. Big Tom's face had gone from red to purple to white, like all the blood was draining out of him. For the first time in 6 years, for the first time maybe in his whole life, he looked small, powerless, caught. He tried to say something, opened his mouth like words were going to come out, but nothing did. Because what do you say when someone has just stripped away all your lies, all your carefully constructed respectability, all the power you've built on other people's silence? James stood up beside me, put his arm around my shoulders, not possessive, not controlling, just supportive. My wife is telling the truth, he said, his voice carrying across the church, clear and strong, every word of it. And I should have protected her. I should have seen what was happening. I should have stopped it years ago. That's when Mrs. Carson spoke up. Little old Mrs. Carson who taught Sunday school, who everyone thought was too proper to even say the word pregnant out loud. He tried it with me too, she said, her voice shaking but determined. After my Harold died, he came by saying he wanted to help with repairs around the house. But he wanted payment that I wasn't willing to give. Then Mrs. Rodriguez from the Mexican family that worked the farms outside town. Me too. When I was working at his house, cleaning, he said it was part of my job, that if I told anyone, he'd make sure my family never found work in this county again. One by one, woman after woman, some young, some old, some I'd known my whole life, some I barely recognized. They stood up, they spoke up, they told their stories. Stories of intimidation, of coercion, of abuse, of a man who had used his position, his power, his reputation, to hurt woman after woman, year after year, and had counted on their silence, their shame, their fear, to keep his secrets safe. Big Tom tried to leave then, tried to push his way toward the back door. But the men in the congregation, the husbands and fathers and sons of the women who had just spoken up, they blocked his path, not violently, not aggressively, but firmly, with the kind of quiet determination that said, "You're not going anywhere until we figure out what to do with you." Sheriff Williams was there, had been sitting in the back, probably came to pay his respects to my mother, but now he was looking at Big Tom with different eyes. The eyes of a lawman who was finally seeing a pattern, finally understanding that the complaints that had been dismissed, the rumors that had been ignored, the whispered stories that had been written off as women's hysteria, maybe they hadn't been hysteria at all. "Tom Patterson," he said, standing up slow, his hand resting on his belt. "I think you and I need to have ourselves a conversation." The congregation started splitting into two groups then. Those who believed us, who had always suspected but never wanted to see, who were ready to face the truth about someone they'd respected, and those who couldn't accept it, who were already making excuses, already finding reasons why we must be lying, why a pillar of the community couldn't possibly be guilty of such horrible things. "This is a house of God," Reverend Matthews said. But he wasn't talking to Big Tom. He was talking to me, to us, like we were the ones who had brought sin into his sanctuary. Like speaking the truth about evil was somehow worse than the evil itself. Some people walked out then. Families I'd known my entire life. People who had eaten at my table. Who I'd served at church dinners. Who I'd considered friends. They left without looking back, choosing their comfort over our truth, choosing their version of peace over justice. But others stayed. More than I expected. More than I dared to hope. And when Sheriff Williams put handcuffs on Big Tom right there in front of the altar, when he read him his rights in the same voice he'd used to lead the Pledge of Allegiance at 4th of July celebrations, some people applauded, actually applauded, like they were grateful, like they'd been waiting for someone to be brave enough to speak up, like they'd been carrying their own secrets, their own shame, their own fear, and my words had given them permission to finally let it go. The weeks after the arrest were strange, like living in a completely different world than the one I'd known for the past 6 years. The first change was sleep. For the first time since 1956, I slept through the night, without waking up in cold sweats, without listening for footsteps on the porch, without that constant knot of fear in my stomach that had become so familiar I'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. James and I had to learn how to be married all over again. How to talk to each other without the weight of Big Tom's presence hanging over every conversation. How to touch each other without me flinching, without me disappearing inside my own head. It took time, patience, gentle words, and careful hands. But slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice it happening. I started coming back to myself, started remembering the woman I'd been before the nightmare began. The trial was set for spring 1961. Sheriff Williams told me there would be questions, lots of questions, about details I didn't want to remember, about times and places and specifics that would be hard to talk about. But he also told me that with so many women coming forward, with so many similar stories, we had a strong case, that Big Tom's pattern of behavior was clear, that his threats and intimidation tactics were documented now, that his years of using his position to silence his victims were finally working against him. The community split right down the middle. Half the town treated me like a hero. Women would stop me on the street to thank me for speaking up, for giving them courage to tell their own stories, for showing them that silence wasn't the only option, for proving that even powerful men, even respected men, even men who hid behind religion and family values, could be held accountable for their crimes. But the other half, they made life difficult. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, threatening letters left in my mailbox, whispered comments when I walked through town. Some people genuinely couldn't believe that Big Tom was capable of such things. They'd known him their whole lives, had done business with him, had sat next to him in church, had considered him a friend. To them, my accusations weren't just about him. They were about their own judgment, their own ability to see evil when it was right in front of them. And that was too uncomfortable, too threatening to their sense of how the world worked. James lost the lumber mill completely. Big Tom's business partners bought out James's share for much less than it was worth, said they couldn't have the scandal associated with their operation, couldn't have customers wondering if the whole Patterson family was involved in whatever sick things Tom had been doing. So James took a job at the furniture factory 2 towns over, making half what he'd made at the mill, starting over from scratch at 37 years old. But he never complained, never blamed me for the financial hardship, never suggested that maybe I should have kept quiet, that maybe preserving our comfortable life was worth my continued silence. Instead, he'd come home exhausted from 10-hour shifts and still have energy to hold me when the nightmares came. Still have patience to listen when I needed to talk about what had happened. Still have strength to help me prepare for the questions I'd have to answer in court. Dr. Matthews, the same doctor who'd been giving me pills for my nerves, he started seeing me regularly, not for medication this time, but for talking, for what he called therapy, a new word for an old idea, the idea that talking about trauma, putting it into words, speaking it out loud in a safe space, could help heal the wounds that couldn't be seen. I learned new words during those sessions, words like victim, survivor, trauma, post-traumatic stress, words that helped me understand that what I was feeling, what I was experiencing, the panic attacks, The sleepless nights, the way certain sounds or smells could transport me back to those terrible afternoons. All of that was normal, expected, part of how the mind tried to protect itself from unbearable experiences. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. I wasn't broken beyond repair. I was a woman who had survived 6 years of systematic abuse. And survival, Dr. Matthews told me, survival was its own kind of strength, even when it didn't feel strong, even when it felt like the most cowardly thing in the world. The fact that I was still here, still breathing, still fighting, that was proof of a courage I didn't even know I possessed. And slowly, week by week, session by session, I started to believe him. The trial ended in June 1961. Big Tom was convicted on 7 counts of sexual assault, sentenced to 12 years in state prison. It wasn't enough. Could never be enough for what he'd stolen from all of us. But it was something. It was justice. It was the legal system saying that his word, his reputation, his standing in the community, none of that mattered more than the truth. None of that gave him the right to hurt women, to use his power to silence his victims, to hide behind respectability while committing terrible crimes. But the real transformation, the one that mattered most to me, had already happened long before the judge read that verdict. It happened the moment I stood up in that church, the moment I used my voice, the moment I chose truth over silence, courage over fear, my own dignity over keeping the peace. That was the moment I stopped being Thomas Patterson's victim and started becoming Ruth Ellen Patterson, survivor. After the trial, women started coming to me, women from our town, from neighboring counties, from places I'd never even heard of. They'd heard about the church, about how I'd spoken up, about how other women had found their voices too, and they wanted to know how. How do you find the courage to speak when you've been silent for so long? How do you overcome the shame, the fear, the certainty that no one will believe you? How do you rebuild your life after someone has tried to destroy it? I didn't have easy answers, but I had something better. I had my story. I had proof that speaking up was possible, that survival was possible, that healing was possible, even when it felt impossible, even when the whole world seemed stacked against you. James and I started a small group, meeting in our living room once a week. Women who had been hurt, women who were still hurting, women who were ready to start healing. We called it the Cedar Falls Women's Circle, though women came from much farther than Cedar Falls. Some drove hours just to sit in a room with other people who understood, who didn't judge, who didn't ask why they hadn't fought back harder, why they hadn't spoken up sooner, why they had let it happen in the first place. Because we all knew the answers to those questions. We knew about fear, about power, about the way society teaches women to be quiet, to be accommodating, to put everyone else's comfort before their own safety, to believe that keeping peace is more important than seeking justice. I learned that my voice, the voice I'd been so afraid to use for so many years, was powerful in ways I'd never imagined, not just for me, but for other women. Women who needed to hear that they weren't alone, that they weren't crazy, that what happened to them mattered, that they deserved better, that they deserved to be believed. The woman I became after speaking my truth. She was different from the 19-year-old girl who had walked down that church aisle in 1954. Different from the terrified young wife who had let herself be victimized for 6 years. This new woman, this Ruth Ellen, she had scars, deep ones, places where the damage would never fully heal. But she also had something the old Ruth Ellen had never possessed. She had unshakable knowledge of her own worth, her own strength, her own right to take up space in the world, to speak her mind, to say no when no was the right answer, to demand respect instead of just hoping for it. The nightmares still came sometimes. The panic attacks hadn't completely disappeared. There were still moments when a man's voice, an unexpected touch, the sound of heavy footsteps, could transport me back to those terrible afternoons. But now I had tools. I had Dr. Matthews's therapy techniques. I had James's unwavering support. I had a community of women who understood. Most importantly, I had the knowledge that I had survived the worst thing I could imagine. And if I could survive that, I could survive anything. I could not only survive, I could thrive. I could help others thrive too. I could turn my pain into purpose, my trauma into triumph, my silence into a voice that could change lives, including my own. The girl who married James Patterson in 1954. She had believed that love was enough, that being good and quiet and accommodating would keep her safe. The woman I became. She knew better. She knew that love without respect is hollow. That safety has to be claimed, not just hoped for. That being good means standing up for yourself, and for others who can't stand up yet. That making noise, speaking truth, refusing to be silenced. Sometimes that's the most righteous thing you can do. It's 1967 now. 7 years since that day in my mother's church when everything changed. I'm sitting on my front porch again, the same porch where this story began. But everything else is different. The house is different. We sold the little place behind Big Tom's property. Too many bad memories soaked into those walls. Too many echoes of footsteps that shouldn't have been there. This new house, it's smaller, more modest, but it's ours, completely ours. No spare keys given out to anyone. No unexpected visitors. No one walking through my door without permission. The locks are strong, and I'm the only one who decides when they get opened. James is different too. Grayer at the temples. Lines around his eyes that weren't there in 1954. Some from the stress of starting over. Some from the weight of knowing what his own father did to his wife. But mostly, the lines come from smiling more, from laughing more, from being married to a woman who isn't afraid of her own shadow anymore. A woman who can look him in the eye without flinching, who can let him hold her without disappearing inside her own head, who can fight with him when they disagree, instead of just agreeing to keep the peace. The town is different too. Some people still cross the street when they see me coming, still whisper behind their hands, still think I should have kept quiet, should have let sleeping dogs lie, should have preserved the Patterson family reputation instead of destroying it with my inconvenient truths. But more people, many more, they nod when they see me. They smile. They stop to chat about the weather, about their own struggles, about their daughters and sisters and friends who have found courage because I found mine first. The Cedar Falls Women's Circle has grown beyond anything I ever imagined. We meet in the church basement now, the same church where I first spoke my truth. Reverend Matthews is long gone, replaced by a younger man, Pastor Williams, who believes that God's house should be a place of healing, not a place where truth gets buried to preserve comfort. We have 30 women now, some weeks more. They come from 5 different counties. They bring their stories, their pain, their hope, their determination to heal, to help others heal, to make sure that what happened to us doesn't happen to the next generation of daughters, of wives, of women who deserve better than what we got. I'm different most of all. The woman sitting on this porch today, she bears the same name as the girl who married James Patterson 13 years ago. But that's about all they have in common. This woman knows things that girl never dreamed she'd need to know. Knows that respect isn't automatically given with age or position. It has to be earned. Knows that family doesn't mean you have to accept abuse. It means you protect each other from it. Knows that speaking truth isn't disrespectful, even when the truth makes people uncomfortable, especially when it makes people uncomfortable. This woman has calluses on her hands from real work, not just housework, but the work of rebuilding a life, of creating something meaningful from something that was nearly destroyed, of turning pain into purpose, trauma into triumph, silence into strength. The wind chimes still hang from my porch ceiling, but they're different chimes now, louder ones, made of brass instead of tin. When the wind catches them, they don't just tinkle quietly. They ring out, clear and strong, like a bell calling people to attention, like a voice that refuses to be silenced, like the sound of a woman who has learned, finally learned, that her voice matters, that her truth matters, that her life, her dignity, her right to safety and respect and peace, all of that matters more than keeping other people comfortable, more than preserving other people's secrets, more than protecting other people's reputations at the cost of her own soul. I'm still Ruth Ellen Patterson, but now I know what that name really means. It means survivor. It means fighter. It means a woman who looked evil in the face and refused to let it win. I'm 78 years old now, sitting here in 2025, looking back on a life that could have been defined by what one evil man did to me, but wasn't, because I chose differently. I chose to define my own life, to write my own story, to turn my deepest pain into my greatest purpose. The Cedar Falls Women's Circle is still meeting, though I don't run it anymore. Younger women have taken over, women with fresh energy and new ideas, but the same mission, the same commitment to making sure no woman suffers in silence. No woman believes she has to accept abuse as the price of keeping peace. No woman thinks her voice doesn't matter. My legacy isn't the trauma I endured. It's what I built from the ashes of that trauma. It's the hundreds of women who found their voices because I found mine. It's the families that stayed together because someone finally spoke truth instead of protecting lies. It's the children who grew up safer because their mothers learned to say no, learned to demand respect, learned to choose courage over comfort. If you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself in it, if you're living with secrets that are eating you alive, if you're accepting treatment that makes your soul shrivel up inside, if you're staying quiet to keep other people comfortable while you die a little more each day, please hear me. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. Your dignity and safety and peace of mind. They matter more than anyone else's reputation, more than family loyalty, more than keeping up appearances, more than any reason someone has given you to stay silent. Speaking up is terrifying. I know. I lived with that terror for 6 years. But staying silent is worse. It's a different kind of death, a slow poisoning of everything good inside you. And you deserve better. You deserve so much better. You deserve to take up space in this world, to breathe freely, to sleep peacefully, to live without fear, without shame, without the constant weight of someone else's secrets crushing your spirit. The first time you use your voice, the first time you say no, the first time you choose yourself over someone else's comfort, it might feel like the world is ending, but it's not the world ending. It's the beginning of your real life, the life where you matter, where your feelings count, where you don't have to earn the right to basic human dignity. That life is waiting for you. It's been waiting all along. You just have to be brave enough to claim it. And if this old grandmother could find that courage at 67 years old, standing in a church full of people who didn't want to hear the truth, then you can find it too, wherever you are, whatever your circumstances, however powerful the people who are hurting you might seem. You have more strength than you know. You have more value than they've let you believe. You have a voice that deserves to be heard. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below sharing how it affected you. And don't forget to follow this channel, because this old grandmother has many more stories that need to be told. Stories that might just change someone's life. Stories of women who found their strength, who claimed their power, who refused to let evil win. Your story could be one of them. Your voice could be the one that saves someone else. The way other women's voices saved me. We're stronger together. We're braver together. And we're never, ever alone.